everyone, this is Eve Picker, and if you listen to this podcast series, you're going to learn how to make some change. Thanks so much for joining us on this podcast. I'm Eve Picker, and my life revolves around cities, real estate, crowdfunding, and change. In this podcast series, we'll be digging deep to discover how we can build better cities by building better buildings. Sandy Wiggins is my guest today. Sandy had an epiphany 25 years ago that has changed all of our lives. Then he was a big-wig developer, having built millions of square feet of traditional buildings. Life was good until one day a friend showed him a small article on the impact that buildings had on the environment that Sandy loved so much. And that conversation forever changed the direction of his life and ours. 25 years later, Sandy has had a hand in building the U.S. Green Building Council, in developing the LEED rating system, in developing over 60 LEED-rated commercial buildings and the nation's first gold-certified homes. Sandy's personal epiphany has impacted many lives. If you want to know more about Sandy after you've listened to this podcast, please visit evepicker.com, where you'll find links and other goodies on the show notes page, and where you can subscribe to my newsletter on all things real estate impact. So Sandy, just tell us a little bit about your background and what path led you to where you are today.
Sure. So I followed initially in my career, a pretty traditional path in development and construction. Worked in both residential and commercial sectors, also did some institutional work, and spent the better part of 2 decades following that path, and actually worked all over the eastern United States on many different kinds of projects, and then reached a point where I was the executive vice president of a firm that I helped build into a fairly large firm, and was feeling that something wasn't right. I was working on a project in Philadelphia where I lived at the time, and was out to lunch with the architect, who was a friend. And during our lunch conversation, he shared a tiny little article in an architectural magazine about the environmental impact of building and buildings. And I was kind of stunned by that. I'd been a passionate outdoors person and environmentalist my whole life, but had never connected that passion with what I did for a living. It became an itch that I just couldn't stop scratching. I wanted to understand it. And on that project, we tried to do the best we could, but there was very little information available to help us. I started to bring people together in the Philadelphia community who were interested in having a conversation about that. We would meet informally once a month. There were a few architects, another developer, a person from city government, and that little group grew to maybe 15 or 20 people. And then I decided that we should actually launch a more formal effort and started a nonprofit in Philadelphia focused on greening the built environment. At the time, it was called the Delaware Valley Green Building Council. Today, it's called Green Building United. And through that platform, began to connect to other people around the country who were also thinking about these issues, and which ultimately led me to the very nascent U.S. Green Building Council. And I became very involved in that, in the development of the LEED rating systems and moving those out into the marketplace and helping to build USGBC.
That's pretty spectacular.
Yeah. Well, it was...
How long did all of that take? From when you first saw the article to...
So, when I first saw that article, I want to say it was 1993. USGBC began to form in the late 90s. It was a very small community of people. LEED, the very first pilot version of LEED, was launched in 2000. By 2007, we'd hit a tipping point, and LEED was becoming the standard for pretty much any what I would call Class A building in the United States, and it was propagating around the world. So, it had been adopted in China and India and other countries. So it moved very rapidly.
Yeah, that is pretty fast.
Yeah.
I tried using LEED on a renovation of a historic building in the early 2000s, and I gave up. At that time, it was really geared towards greenfield developments.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which was kind of weird when you think about it. It was just too hard for a small, not a huge project, a smaller project in a city. So I think that's changed too, right?
It has changed a lot. I mean, there are now many versions of LEED that are designed to suit different kinds of projects. There's LEED for neighborhood developments, and now there's LEED for cities, and there's the well building standard. And so there's many other pathways that people can follow to help them develop green buildings and green communities.
So, I mean, do you think those sorts of ratings are the answers, or building in a socially responsible way, I suppose?
Are they the answers? No, they're just a tool. And even, I mean, first of all, from an environmental perspective, so I've gone on and become involved with net zero energy projects, living building challenge and living community challenge projects. From an environmental perspective, I mean, LEED has been catalytic in terms of raising awareness in the industry. It certainly has had an incremental impact in terms of the environmental impact of buildings, but it's still just doing less bad, and we need to do a whole lot better. From a socially responsible perspective, LEED has really lagged in terms of addressing any issues of social equity. They're starting to take pieces of that on. But Living Building Challenge, for example, has a very distinct focus on social equity and social justice. But still, the rating systems are just a tool. We fundamentally need to change the mindset that we're operating from in order to really address both the social and environmental issues that we're facing right now.
Be sure to go to evepicker.com and sign up for my free educational newsletter about impact real estate investing. You'll be among the first to hear about new projects you can invest in. That's evepicker.com. Thanks so much. Yeah, one of the things that worries me is that LEED is a tool that's just for one segment of society, one industry. Mm-hmm. And most people don't know about it at all. I suppose they only get to know about it when they use the building. But I really think for an understanding of what's going on to filter into everyone's minds, you have to speak in plain English. And many of these ratings and words that we use are not plain English for most people. And so we're kind of a long way from most people understanding what needs to happen.
I agree.
Yeah. So, well, that's pretty amazing. So that's been a long time coming. So what else do you think might be improved in the world of real estate impact? Or even real estate impact investing?
Yeah, great question. Talking about real estate impact investing, the availability of capital creates so many possibilities that we aren't taking advantage of. And I mean, frankly, it comes from the economic mindset that drives all of our behavior, which is fundamentally about eking out the maximum profit, financial profit from every dollar that we invest. So when I talk about a mindset shift, that's really what I'm talking about. We really need to, we need to stop externalizing the environmental and social impacts of our investments decisions and start looking at those investments in a much more holistic way to understand what are those environmental and social impacts. How can we start to actually include them in our decision-making process about the return that we're getting for the capital that we're putting to work. So that fundamentally needs to change, and it is changing. I mean, there is a growing community of impact or mission investors who are thinking about these issues and who aren't willing to invest in anything, including real estate projects that are moving the needle in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I've heard statistics now of as high as 85% of investors want to invest in some sort of socially responsible way in their portfolio. It's a very big number now.
Yeah. That's another sort of hockey stick.
It really is.
Yeah.
But I have to say, my disappointment with this, and I know that we've talked about this before, I have yet to see investors with really deep pockets invest in, or let's say accredited investors, not necessarily investors with really deep pockets, but I think people are still quibbling about the return they're going to get. They want a return and they want social responsibility. They don't seem yet ready to give up on the return. I think you're working with or seeing an elite group of people who are educated enough to understand that they have to give up something. Mm-hmm. I'm not seeing that yet.
Yeah, it's obviously it's difficult territory, and it's slow because the underlying paradigm that we all operate from creates this economic system that and this is very deep, Eve. I mean, this is it's fundamentally about security and survival, and so we live in a system driven by these underlying beliefs or paradigms that see us as separate from each other, separate from the environment, that give rise to, even though these aren't conscious, the belief that resources are scarce, that I have to look out for myself. And so one of the fallouts of that is this hyper-focus on aggregating resources for myself and, maximizing financial return. So when we talk about investing in socially responsible or sustainable communities, we need to be thinking about much more than just the built environment. We need to be thinking about the social systems in those communities. And the built environment really has a huge impact in framing how those systems operate. So it's all deeply intertwined. But ultimately, here's what I see happening in the world. And this is nascent. And it's going to, hopefully more and more people will get to this, but there are many people that are experiencing the perspective that we are deeply interconnected and inextricably interconnected with each other and with the natural environment, and that we need to be thinking about how our resources are deployed to support each other as well as ourselves. And so you see, things like co-housing is a great example of this. It's a tiny little part of the development world. The co-housing started in Denmark, 60 years ago, and first spread around Europe. And, now it's happening in the United States, but it's still there's only maybe 300 co-housing communities in the US. But it's a pattern of development that is designed to support community and connection to each other and caring for each other. And so that's where I think we have to go.
I think that's right. But I think that many of us have been let down by communities around us, over racial and religious issues and many other issues. And it's difficult to trust given that, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's not, I suppose it's not hard to understand why people feel they need to look after themselves first.
Yeah, no, it's not. I mean, it's completely understandable because it is wired into our system, but it's not an absolute, I guess is what I would say. It's based on a series of beliefs that have been built up over centuries, and particularly the last 2 centuries. And it's difficult to change, but honestly, from where I sit, having spent the last 20 years now deeply involved in environmental sustainability, social justice, from the perspective, much of that from the perspective of real estate development and impact investing, we have to change or we're not going to survive.
So then What do you like best about the world of real estate impact investing? What do you think it can do? Good things that it can do. I mean, I know my small hope for small change is that, we can list a project in a neighborhood and people who live there can invest in it and benefit not only from seeing that project built where they already might own an asset, their own house, but that they can build wealth where they live as well. So that's kind of my little piece of excitement about real estate.
Yeah, and frankly, that excites me a lot. And to me, it's an important and beautiful step in the direction that we need to take. When people invest in their own communities, so in the dominant system, that we're all a part of, I mean, people put their money into mutual funds and public equities. They are completely disconnected from their investment. So it's complex, it's opaque, and disconnected, and it's really strictly focused on short-term financial return. And what is needed is a shift to investment that is direct, transparent, personal, and grounded in a system of relationships. And that's what small change is doing, is creating in the real estate industry. If I put my money into a REIT and, the REIT's investing in real estate projects all over the country that I have no connection to, all I care about is the financial return. If I put my money into a building that's going to house the local grocery store in my community, I drive by that store every day. I care about it. It fundamentally changes my relationship to my investment. If that business gets in trouble, yes, I'm worried about my investment, but I also want that business to succeed, and because I have a relationship to it. So I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yeah, no, that's the way I see it too. Yeah. So, I mean, are there any other direct investment opportunities or investment opportunities emerging that you think can help solve this problem of the relationship of you to the place you're in and the people around you?
Obviously, if you're an accredited investor and there are opportunities in your place to directly invest in real estate projects in a more traditional sense, that's helpful. I mean, that's impact investing. If you're working through this lens of, local and sustainable investment, but the system's kind of wired to prevent us from doing that. I mean, regulation crowdfunding is like a first giant step into that space. Although, as you know, it's still really hard and nascent.
Yeah, it is really hard. I think we need a lot of investor education. I think there's a lot of mistrust around it. So let's move on to some other thoughts. I'm just wondering if you think there are any current trends in real estate development that are important. You mentioned co-housing, and we know that co-working has also really taken off as a way for people to share business spaces. But I'm wondering what else is out there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, co-housing and co-working are great examples of new trends that I think really should be supported and that there's a pent-up demand for. I just find this in many of the different networks that I'm connected to, that there's a demand for product that isn't being developed because developers are generally trying to maximize return or just don't understand this emergent market. But again, I can't help but kind of come back to the necessity to respond to what are now becoming environmental emergencies that we're facing. And so when, climate change or climate crisis, as people are starting to call it now, is Exhibit A, and the development community needs to respond to that. I mean, everybody needs to respond to it. Government needs to respond to it. The codes that govern development need to respond to it, but the development community needs to and can respond to it. So net zero energy development, things like the Living Building Challenge and Living Community Challenge are stakes in the ground that are moving us in the right direction. And frankly, I've worked on enough net zero energy projects now to understand that we have all the technology we need to do this. I mean, not every building can be net zero energy independently, particularly in dense urban environments when you're dealing with multi-story structures. But when you start to look at whole communities, we can build net zero energy communities. And for me, there's just no excuse for us not to be going there.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I haven't been watching what's been happening in the code world, but, I still talk to developers who fuss about, how many parking spaces they're going to have. And there's certainly requirements in the city I live in for parking, although they're reduced in some places. But I could imagine build a net zero energy building and provide bike racks for everyone. And is there really a need for parking at all? I think you'd get much better development. It would help the environment. It would be friendlier for the city. I don't see that shift happening in most places yet. It's a really big shift.
It is. And I mean, you're right. It's not happening in most places. I happen to live in a city that's really progressive in this regard to Washington, D.C. So the zoning codes are changing, the building codes are changing. There's a very robust overarching, they call it the Sustainable DC plan, that's driving this, that is championed both by the mayor and city council. So it is happening in places. And having been involved in movement building in the past, I see that as a really hopeful sign, because one of the things that needs to happen is that functional exemplars have to emerge so that other people can say, okay, you can actually do this, and we can copy that. Right. And so San Francisco, DC, are two communities where that's starting to happen.
Right. So just a really great example. I'm looking at a smallish project in Pittsburgh, which is, we think, going to be a 20 or maybe a 30 unit building. And most of the first floor is going to be taken up with parking because it's required in the code. It's an expensive use of the space. The building is very close to downtown. It's flat. It's bikeable. I would be thrilled if the city said to me, okay, give us a net zero energy building and we'll eliminate the parking requirement.
Right.
I don't actually know the costs, but I'm going to guess that we end up maybe in the same place.
Yep.
And that would be, that's a really good example of what I think ought to happen.
Yep. I agree.
But it isn't happening yet. So,
yeah. So here's another, one of the, again, for the development community, once you understand the importance of this, it really becomes your responsibility to become an advocate for it. And I will tell you that having, again, spent many years now working on projects that are kind of pushing the edge of what's possible in terms of particularly environmental sustainability, the hardest part is dealing with the regulatory environment. I can't tell you how many hours I've spent educating and advocating with local agencies, state agencies, even the federal government, to enable the kind of development that really should be occurring.
Oh, you don't have to tell me. First of all, I have a funding portal, so you know what that means, right?
Yes, right.
And secondly, I was the first loft developer in downtown Pittsburgh at a time where literally a banker I went to said to me, "Oh, honey, no one's going to live there."
Right. Yep.
So, yeah, it requires... it's a lot of work, but it's also a lot of fun, making something change for the better.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So do you see any particular community engagement tools that could help or have worked or work well?
So another great question. What I've come to believe is that the most valuable asset that you have with any capital project is the attention of a large community of stakeholders around that project. So, whenever there's development, whether it's a single home or a whole neighborhood or, a downtown high-rise building, there are lots of people who are interested in what's going on. Many of them are might be NIMBYs, but that attention is incredibly valuable. And so using processes that take advantage of that attention to educate and enroll and build consensus about what's going to happen is critically important. Most of the projects that I get involved with, we use something called a dynamic planning process, where we're really inviting all those stakeholders' voices into the design and development, including the people that are the alligators, the ones that want to come up and kind of bite you in the backside. Because their voices are important. You need to hear them and understand them. And if they're, what I've found consistently is, if they're treated with respect and invited in and heard, and you really spend the time to understand what's driving their concern or issue, that almost always you can find a way to turn those alligators into advocates.
That requires a lot of patience, I think.
It does, yeah.
So, what are you working on today? What's your project at the moment?
At the moment, I've got there's a cluster of living building challenge projects that I've been working on for a number of years, just outside of DC in Maryland. It's called the Potomac Watershed Study Center. And so that's ongoing. We're down to the final phase of that project after almost a decade. I'm working on a living community challenge project in Yellow Springs, Ohio, with Antioch College. Again, it's been many years, but we've been through a master planning process. And if everything goes right, there'll actually be a pilot phase constructed this year. And I'm working on some local projects in the DC market that are, attempting to be net zero energy and or living building challenge projects. So those are the real estate projects I'm working on. I spent a lot of time working in the mission investing space too. So
yeah, it's pretty fabulous. So I may yet come to you for advice on this little project in Pittsburgh, how to tackle that idea. Mm-hmm. So I've got 3 sign-off questions for you. Mm-hmm. What is the key factor that you believe makes a real estate project impactful, or that makes a real estate project impactful to you?
Mm-hmm. So I would say the key factor that makes a real estate project impactful.
Factors.
Or factors. Yeah. I mean, a number of things come up for me. I mean, one, that it really is environmentally responsive. And that is in terms of, the kind of environmentally responsive things we talk about with sustainability, energy efficiency, water, things like that it's environmentally responsive to the community that it's in, that it is really additive to the health and vitality of the community that it's a part of, and that it has successfully engaged the stakeholders who around that project, not just the end users, but everybody who's going to be impacted by it in ways that are satisfying and that are actually building community. So those are the things that rise up for me.
Okay, that's a pretty big list. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, other than by raising money, in what ways can involving investors through crowdfunding benefit the impact real estate developer?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, what comes up for me is this idea of attention. When an investor is investing through crowdfunding in a project that they can kind of see, touch, feel, something that's in their community or a community that's part of their universe, there's an opportunity to build relationship, for deep engagement, for education. That's what comes up for me.
Okay. Yeah. And then this is a really big one, but how do you think real estate development in the U.S. can be improved?
Oh, boy.
I have ideas.
Yeah.
But there's really so much bad real estate development still going on that I know that's a really big question. But
it's a huge question. It's such a big question. I'm not sure how to answer it other than, at a very high level, and say it's not about the money. It's about giving people better lives. And so if we approach it from that perspective, that's the improvement that we need, that every development project should be about improving the quality of people's lives, and that includes our relationship with the natural world. That's how it has to be improved.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer. Mm-hmm. I think maybe it's a threatening and overwhelming thought for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But the way I like to, when things are really big, I like to think about them in chunks. And it's not that a building has to solve everything, but it could tackle one or two things. If you're just going to focus on making sure that the people who live in the building don't have huge utility bills, that's a start, right?
Right.
So it doesn't have to solve everything. But in any case, I really enjoyed talking to you, and I'm sure we're going to talk again soon, Sandy.
All right, Eve.
Thank you very much.
Yep, I've enjoyed it too. Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
That was Sandy Wiggins. What a great conversation that was. I feel a little diminished beside Sandy's extraordinary accomplishments. Sandy gave me 3 great takeaways. First, that the real estate industry was waiting for guidance on environmental impact, evidenced by the speed with which the LEED rating system was adopted. Second, that there are lots of pathways that you can follow to build sustainably today, including LEED, the Wellbeing Standard, Net Zero, and Passive House Standard. And third, addressing issues of social equity must come next. What did you learn? You can read more about Sandy on the show notes page for this podcast at evepicker.com. While you're there, please consider signing up for my newsletter to find out more about how to make money in real estate while making some change. Thank you so much for spending your time with Sandy and I today. We'll talk again soon, but for now, this is Eve Picker signing off to go make some change.